Got one from CNN here, I'll tell you, it's a somewhat less good of a video by Leah Miller that was recommended to me, I believe, by the Anti-Corporatist. Thank you very much. But first, let's look at the CNN take on this. The concept is, why do right-wingers hate democracy? Genuinely. I realize that's the kind of thing you might hear a right-winger say, but we have also learned in recent years that they are very much the rubber and glue types, and they are eager to call other people out for behavior that they are actually the ones participating in. So, no, right-wingers don't care for democracy at all. CNN talked about it. Let's see if we agree with their assessment.
Warns America is at risk, facing an authoritarian backlash as it moves toward a multiracial democracy and tyranny of the minority. Two Harvard professors take a look at why they believe America's democracy is being attacked from within. They argue the country lags dangerously behind other modern democracies, and part of it because of issues like January 6th, but also because it hasn't taken any steps to eliminate minority rule. And that, they say, has allowed a minority to thwart the will of American voters. And joining us now to talk about this are the authors of the book, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat. Stephen and Daniel, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. It's a very important book. And I think a lot of folks have been grasping to try to figure out, well, what is going on with our country? Why is our democracy in peril, it feels like, to a lot of Americans? But let's get to the title. Because that, I think, we just need to get that out of the gate. What does tyranny of the minority mean? And I'll start with you, Stephen.
Well, we are the only presidential democracy in the world where the president can lose the election, lose the popular vote, and become president. We are one of the few democracies in the world where a major legislative body, the Senate, the party that loses the popular vote can control, and routinely does control, the Senate. We are the only established democracy in the world where justices have lifetime tenure. There's no term limits. There's no retirement age. So this set of institutions and others allows political minorities to systematically thwart and sometimes even govern over majorities. Very quickly, think back to 2016. Donald Trump lost the popular vote and won the presidency. In the U.S. Senate, the Democrats won the popular vote, and the Republicans came away with control of the Senate. That president and that Senate went on to nominate and confirm 3 justices, which totally transformed the nature of the Supreme Court. We have one of the very few democracies in the world where minorities, political minorities, can routinely block, thwart, even rule over majorities.
Right. And Daniel, let me ask you this.
So just to be clear, why do we have that? Because the minority who is ruling wants us to have that. So how do we get rid of that? Well, we make sure that minority rule is broken in 1 year. That means we're going to have to engage in yet another unfair fight. We're going to know it's unfair. We're going to know that in our best estimates, even if we do a great job fighting gerrymandering, it's still going to be a major, major factor in the House. We have to win, regardless. Now, in the past, we got told that was the case. But we did not have the culture developed to do anything about it when we did win, when we had those big victories. We expected that was the end of the fight. That's not. And this is going to be first of all, what you and I have to sell to the American people. And also what we have to fundamentally understand. There is a class in between the voter and the politician, which you and I now occupy. The organizing class. We need to convince the voters to give us the tools to do something in 2024. Actually, 2025. End of 2024 is when the voters need to act. We are also part of the voting class. Everybody is part of the voting class, in fact. But what we need out of the people that are only in the voting class is to give us the necessary tools. We need progressives. The ideal situation would be a super majority. I don't think we're going to get this, but we're going to try for it. A super majority in the House, Senate, and White House. And then you and I go to work again. Oh my God, that poor spine. I ask it for so much when I wiggle. Once we have, at the very least, control of the House, Senate, and White House, then we pass major, fundamental legislative changes. That's when we can get Medicare for all. That's when we can get rid of the Electoral College, and so on and so forth. But we need first to activate the voters. So understand that we are not selling them on yet another giant effort followed by faith in the political class. No. We have held that faith under the water till the bubbles stop. No, you and I will have to take over at that point, and we will control those politicians who will be reliant on us to make it through the primaries. We must learn from those people who have hurt us. Example, MAGA. They took over their party. We should do the same with ours. But we don't do it with all the extra nonsense they bring in that frankly shows them for who they truly are deep down and ruins any political point they might have ever made. Yet their strategy is dead on. Above all else, those politicians who I suspect don't really love their families, don't really give a if their families get blown up by some MAGA terrorist, but they sure do love themselves and their careers. That much, maybe they do love their families. I don't know, but the thing to threaten is not their well-being, it's their career. That we know they love. That we know they're willing to do a lot for. They're willing to lie for. They're willing to cheat for. They're willing to steal for. Their careers, no matter what side of the aisle they're on, are a treasured thing to politicians. It's a paycheck. It's a good paycheck to politicians. So, we make them dependent on us to keep that. That is the ultimate bribe, the office itself.
Both argue in the book that the Republican Party has turned away from democracy, and rather than expel these anti-democratic extremists from their ranks, that the GOP has essentially accepted and made room for them, starting with the former president, of course. How big is the authoritarian movement in the party right now, would you say? Is it the party?
Yeah, well, you have to think that to be a political party that's committed to democracy, you have to do three basic things. First of all, you have to accept elections, win or lose. Second of all, you have to never use violence to gain power or to hold on to power. And most critically, in some sense, you have to also distance yourself from political actors who engage in those first two behaviors. And what's so shocking and troubling about the current dynamic in the United States is that we have a political party that's violating increasingly all three of those, and especially that last third category. When you think about mainstream politicians, people who wear business attire, suits that look like normal Democratic politicians are committed to, they look like they're committed to democracy. They sound sometimes like they're committed to democracy. But if they know that their allies are engaging in violence or engaging in election denialism, to accept that, to not condemn it, to not say we have nothing to do with that, that's unacceptable, is to enable an authoritarian strand within their own party. And just a final note there is that, look, we've studied democracies and democratic breakdowns throughout history. And what we've discovered is very often the enablers, those who look like semi-loyal, those who look like democratic politicians, but actually who are not, are the ones who ultimately get democracy into trouble.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that we're covering today is how down in Florida, the Florida Republican Party has said they're not going to have this loyalty pledge anymore. That was what Donald Trump wanted. He didn't want to have a loyalty pledge in order to get on the Florida ballot. Let me ask you about this, Stephen. It takes me to my next question, which is a lot of this about Donald Trump? If he becomes the president next year, what does that mean for the country? But if he loses, could that mean that some of the problems that you're talking about, that they might be alleviated somewhat? What do you think?
It's only partially about Donald Trump. As Daniel just said, what's really critical, a single leader, even a very popular demagogue like Donald Trump, cannot destroy a democracy by himself. It takes the enabling of a political party, of a major political party, the toleration, the support, the protection of a major political party to enable him to do a lot of damage. And so the problem is that the Republican Party leadership, even though in private they will speak very badly of Donald Trump, continue to support him in public. And one reason that they do that, and this gets back to the minority rule side of our book, is that the Republican Party as a whole nationally doesn't have to win national majorities. It can win the presidency through the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. It's lost the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 elections, and yet it's won 3 out of the last 8 elections. Same thing in the Senate. They don't need to win the popular vote to win control of the Senate. So a party that doesn't need to win majorities, that's protected in a sense by the Constitution, can get away with playing around with Donald Trump rather than looking for a candidate or looking for a platform that can win national majorities.
Don't have a ton to say other than he's right. That is a correct assessment. And the thing to do about it, House, Senate, White House, 2024, major structural changes pushed by the organizers, that's you, that's me, after we gain the House, Senate, and White House. Currently, any bill that we want is not going to come from the House in order to be passed by the Senate and signed by the president. We lost out on half of Biden's presidency when we lost the House. That's how it works. We need to regain the House. And frankly, when we had the Senate, we barely had the Senate. We were reliant on pleasing, God help us, Kirsten, whatever the hell, Sinema, who is no longer even a Democrat in name, and Manchin, who is a conservative, whatever he calls himself. He is a coal mine owner. Fuck that guy. We needed their votes in the first half of Biden's presidency. I know Biden ain't exactly our dream husband here, but let's be real. He's shown a willingness to match the political leanings of the House and Senate that he is provided with. Let's take advantage of that.
And Daniel, I mean, that takes me to my next question. You both write that the Constitution is part of the problem here. You're proposing the elimination of the Electoral College, noting that we're the only democracy in the world. And I do think it is worth underlining. We're the only democracy in the world that still has the Electoral College, or that has an Electoral College. Let's talk about that.
And let's point out, we are a failing democracy. Remember what our big brag used to be? Do you remember that? The peaceful transfer of power. We used to brag about that. Even after the Civil War, for some reason, we still bragged about it. That's twice now. 2 times that we have not had a peaceful transfer of power. Time number 1, we had a whole war about it. And then we let stochastic terrorists give a domestic terrorist the courage necessary to assassinate President Lincoln. The man who replaced Lincoln decided that the South was going to get treated like they were heroes, not traitor scum, for attempting to secede in order to keep black people in chains. Then the second time, January 6th. And we didn't even need to get rid of the Lincoln there, because he appointed Merrick freaking Garland to get to the bottom of what happened. And Merrick Garland said, we're going to treat these traitors as gently as possible, except the times have changed slightly. So to him, anybody that makes less than $1 million a year, they're not people. They can go to prison. All the J6ers who got tricked by Trump, they can go to prison. Just not people in his eyes. Which to him, that means rich people.
Yes, so, I mean, and of course, our Constitution is a remarkable document, and there's many great virtues to it. But one of the things we have to remember is that
its greatest virtue is that it can change. That's built right into it.
Over the
Please say that.
last, since its founding, we've improved the Constitution. We've done the hard work of making our Constitution more democratic. Women got the right to vote at the beginning of the 20th century by amending the Constitution. We began to elect senators rather than appoint senators at the beginning of the 20th century. And our democracy has strengthened itself over time through amendments, through improving it. What's tragic in our view is that in the last 50 years, we've sort of stopped doing that work. Whereas other democracies have continued to make their constitutions more democratic. Since around 1970, we've abandoned that project. So what we propose in the last chapter of the book, we lay out 15 proposals for institutional reforms that we think not only are essential, but are, at some level are possible and would help us restore the kind of faith that we feel like we need to have in our democracy.
And didn't we get close to getting rid of the Electoral College, or there was some movement towards this? And correct me if I'm mistaken, Richard Nixon of all people, sounded favorable to the idea. That might strike people as being very strange. Stephen, let me have you take that one.
Yeah, we got very, very close to abolishing the Electoral College. Because as Daniel said, we've stopped doing the work of trying to make our system more democratic over the last 50 years. Most of us can't remember a period anymore where we actually thought seriously about reforming the Constitution, but we used to do it, and we tried and came very close in the late 1960s. The leaderships of both political parties supported abolition of the Electoral College. Richard Nixon, the AFL-CIO, the Chamber of Commerce, the American Bar Association. The House voted overwhelmingly to abolish the Electoral College. There was a majority in the Senate, and something like 75% of Americans in polls supported it. But it didn't get the 2/3 that it needed in the Senate, and so it died.
Minority rule was protected there, I guess. And finally, Daniel, one last question to you. What do you say to critics out there who might,
Let's talk about that 2/3 for a moment, because that's the supermajority I was referring to. How do we get there? Are we going to get there in 2024? No. We're going to try, but we will not get it. Simple. I mean, all right. Let me do this like 2016. There's a 15% chance, let's say. It's an arbitrary number. A 15% chance. Let's downgrade that. A 5% chance that we will get a supermajority necessary for this. That means there's a 95% chance we won't. Does that mean we toss all other plans out the window and scramble for that very unlikely thing? Try to up that percent chance from a 5 to a 7 to a 9? No. Because in that most favorable of situations, that still leaves us with a 91% chance that all our efforts will be in vain. No, you do the humble victories first, unfortunately. You got to win a couple of elections in succession. You do that by step 1, getting people who are serious in power. You get, and that's not as vague as it seems. You just get people in power who you understand the motivations of. It's not based off a notion. It's not based off, well, they barbecue and I like to barbecue. they must be like me. No, that's the nonsense they use to trick you. That's part of why Bernie Sanders is so beloved. He doesn't play that. He does what he does, and he is who he is, and he's very upfront about that, but he's not playing somebody in order to trick us into believing that he is somehow going to look out for our interests. No, you know he's going to look out for our interests based on the words he says and the actions he takes. He states goals, and he campaigns for those goals. We need that multiplied by about 200 more politicians in order to sway things. Oh, if that sounds like a tremendous get, it is for one election. But if you get a significant group of progressives, I'm talking a couple squads worth of the squad, and you start getting popular legislation passed, this will have a cumulative effect. I have seen it in Michigan. I've seen the promised land. Oh, Michigan looked so purple. So purple. Michigan was controlled at the state level by Republicans time and time again. Michigan voted for Trump 2016. What was the thing that changed? Well, number one, in Michigan, the redistricting changed in 2018. Following that, in 2020, there was a wave, a blue wave, a beautiful blue wave. And then progressive legislation got passed, and people liked it. It's that simple. The W's just keep coming. 2022, the hold of progressives, or at the very least, let's just call them Democrats in Michigan, strengthened. You build on victories, in other words. That is how you get a supermajority. And is it likely, let's say, at one election from now, hell, 2 elections from now, is it likely that we're going to get the kind of supermajority that's necessary? Still no. But if we can keep it together, we can up our percent chance to 35, 40, 45, 49, 51, 52. It will never be guaranteed until it happens. But we can make it more likely to happen by showing up and by having candidates that show up and ensuring those candidates legislate the way they said they would. That is going to mean ruthless use of the primary. Ruthless use of the primary. And of course, your full-throated support and your frequent participation doesn't have to be the only thing you do with your time. In fact, you don't need to spend a terribly long amount of time actually doing any of this stuff. But 10 strategic emails to the right people over the course of 6 months can make a world of difference. Volunteering for 2 or 3 weekends over the course of the next year can make a tremendous difference. Donating just $1, to 30 different candidates can make a world of difference. Why? Because you're not just funding their campaign with your dollar. Imagine I had this ready to go. You're not just funding your campaign with your dollar. Can you believe they stamped it? They weren't sure if it was a forgery dollar. Moving on. You're also increasing the little fact sheet they get to print out, which says, here's the number of small dollar donors. Here's the number of actual people that donated to us. You're pushing down the amount of money each candidate that you donate to gets per donation, and that's a good thing. When they want to show their credit, when they want to show their credentials for whether or not the people are behind them, they will say, look at this, our average donation is $5, and we had 1 million people donate that amount of money to us, which means we got a $5, which means we have a $5 million budget on which we can run this campaign. That is the kind of effect you will have. But my larger point, your efforts will be cumulative. And try to remember that as you engage in this war of attrition with, billionaires and their henchmen.
Put forward the argument that in some cases you need to have the power of the minority protected if the shoe was on the other foot. And Democrats were in the minority across the board. Might they want to have at least some say in how things are governed?
I would ask, is it partisan to think that the person who wins the most votes should win office? In no other domain of our life do we think majorities shouldn't govern. But we have this one single carve out, in our political system where and so, sometimes the Electoral College has benefited Democrats, sometimes it's benefited Republicans. Sometimes the filibuster benefits Democrats, sometimes it benefits Republicans. The point is that it's unfair. And so that's why we have a set of proposals that we think ultimately will help American democracy as a whole.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. So, why? What was the answer they came up with? Well, Leah Miller, I think, gives a better breakdown of this. We'll view that later. But what I gathered from that segment on CNN was simply because they have a hold of us. Why does the U.S. still have minority rule? Because the minority who is ruling doesn't want to give it up. That's it. Understand, when they say minority rule, it's not rule by minorities. It's not, for example, that what's a kind of Christian that's not particularly that's not the majority. It's not because, let's say, Pentecostals are in charge. That doesn't make it minority rule. It's when Pentecostals are in charge despite the fact that the majority don't want them to be in charge and voted for them not to be in charge, but they wound up being in charge anyway. Except it's not just Pentecostals. It's a group of conservatives which have been plaguing us for my whole life, and when I crack open a history textbook, which is the thing that they desperately don't want you to do, it turns out ever. They have been plaguing us forever. They have been making the country worse forever, since its inception. They started off saying, we ought to stick with the king, those conservatives. And then they said, oh, we ought to have slaves still. And then they said, oh, we should never say there can be a maximum amount of hours that an employee is asked to work. And then they said, weekends, you should never have weekends. Life is for serving the rich. It's not for enjoying. And then they said there should be no homosexuals. And then they said there should be no trans. And then they said interracial marriage, it must be kept illegal. And on and on. And tomorrow they'll have a new terrible idea. And they'll be able to make that terrible idea into law. Unless we do the work of multiple election cycles, which we have already begun, by the way. And we eventually change the very Constitution to get rid of the corrupt system that filth uses to bother the rest of us. It'll be a long fight. But the good news is it's a fun fight because the path to victory involves many smaller victories. And each one of those is incredibly energizing.